All right, thank you everyone for coming. Today I want to share with you what I've come to believe are my golden rules for CCR diving, and I think these are the things that we can take away as lessons learned that I believe if you follow these, then you'll prevent probably 90 to 95% of the accidents that we've seen to date. So, we've got something strange happening with the slides, but anyway, that's all right. So whether you're new to rebreathers, how many of you are new in the room to rebreathers? Okay. Or not rebreather divers yet at all? Okay. Okay, good. And then the rest are experienced rebreather divers? Okay, so about half and half. So whether you're new or experienced, I think these next 30 minutes, if you bring something away from this, that this can save your life. I recently got a really kind of interesting note from someone who told me that some of the presentation material that I'd put on YouTube not only kept them safe, but probably saved their life. And it was just simple stuff, and I think it's common sense. But I realized that perhaps we have to keep hammering this home, because I think what I'm trying to change is the culture of rebreather diving. And Richie Kohler really covered that so well this morning in this room, that it is something that we have to look at differently, like the aviation industry and how they deal with their optional takeoffs and mandatory landings. It's the same thing with CCRs. So why are we here? We're here because we're losing approximately 20 people each year to CCR accidents, and I'd like to see us prevent that. My slides are coming up odd here for some reason, so we'll just have to go with the flow. So there's no magic to it, but as I say, we have to change the culture of rebreather diving. And that means looking at pilot error. Pilot error, human error, what is it? Frequently our accidents are labeled pilot error or human error, and we keep hearing that over and over and over again, and in a way, in our social media world, we almost malign the deceased for making that stupid mistake that they made. But we are all indeed human. I mean, how many of you have ever locked your car keys in the car? Probably all of us. Well, Kevin Gurr once said to me, "Do you think you should have to die for that?" Oh gosh, of course not. And so his philosophy is that he thought that he could engineer out most of these basic human errors. Well, maybe that's possible, and I'm sure that our industry is moving in that direction. But in the interim, how do we change the culture and the training, perhaps, to reflect a better awareness of this human error? I think to begin with, we need to look at how we learn new skills, not just CCRs, but any new skill in life, because I believe that the learning curve, the very basic learning curve, eventually leads to complacency. Richard Pyle, I'm sure you've all read his quote about how when he started, he was completely fresh, and then he became an expert, but then later down the road, he realized he knew nothing at all. CCRs are kind of like that. So if we recognize that there's this curve, how exactly does this happen? And there's a learning model that goes in these steps, from unconscious and incompetent to conscious and incompetent, conscious competent, and to unconscious competent. Oof, equals complacent. Okay, that's a lot of words. So what is that? Let's look at it. Unconscious and incompetent. You've never driven a car before. You get behind the wheel. You really have no awareness of the risks that are ahead of you. And you're completely incompetent of actually driving that vehicle. Same thing when you come to a CCR class. And it doesn't really matter how much diving background you have behind you. You're not fully aware of the risks, and you certainly don't know the skills involved and needed to do it safely. As you take your class, you gain ability, you gain awareness of the risks that are around you, and you start to gain some of that competence. So you get better and better through practice. By the time you're ready to graduate and you've been given your driver's license or your rebreather certification card, you're now conscious of the risks because you've talked about what can get me killed, but you're also competent. So you've demonstrated mastery of each of the skills that the training agency feels are important to define you as a competent driver rebreather diver. So I believe that when you leave that class, you may be the best rebreather diver that you're ever going to be, because you're scared to death and you're driving like 10 and 2 with your hands on the wheel. So what happens to us after that class? How do things go south? Well, this is what happens. We're still competent, skilled, but we become unconscious. So we all take commutes to work in our cars, and if you take that same commute day after day after day, and you drive that same route, we can leave the house, leave the driveway, drive for an hour, get to work, and then kind of scratch our head, pour our first cup of coffee, and realize that we don't actually remember any of the drive to work. There's lots of you that probably dive at sites, the same sites, time after time after time, and you can drop down on the same wall or dive down the same passage in Ginny Springs. And then you're half an hour into the dive and you go, oh my God, I haven't even looked at my PO2, you know? And you're just unconscious, okay? So asleep at the wheel. And this is what leads to complacency. Nothing happened to me yet, so why do I have to keep being scared? Okay? These machines are incredibly reliable today. And I'm actually incredibly grateful that I learned to dive rebreathers in a time when things broke all the time. Because I think that was probably pretty good training. I was scared to death of them because they kept breaking. You know? These days, a student can get a brand new rebreather and not really have a scare or an incident that's a wake-up call in class. And then they can continue their driving career for a while and nothing really happens. It scares them. Nothing really happens to wake them up and bring them back into that sort of conscious driving mode again. And so they start picking up the cell phone, picking up the coffee, driving with their knees, okay, or doing lots of other similar behaviors when they're diving. Until perhaps a moment of clarity. This is not Photoshop, believe it or not. This is truly a guy that did a head-on crash into a peloton from a bicycle race. So he failed to notice the hundreds of racers coming towards him. So that was a sudden wake-up call. If you've ever fallen asleep at the wheel of the car, has anyone ever done that? I did, actually, as a young teenager, and I remember knowing that I was falling asleep and my head's bobbing and like, oh, stay awake, head's bobbing, and oh gosh, stay awake, stay awake. But it wasn't until I sort of drifted off the edge of the road and hit the rumble strips and heard, you know, where it's like, oh my God, you know, and I woke right up and I pulled the car over and I got out of the car and I walked around and I went, oh man, you know, I could have ended up in the ditch here. And that moment of clarity kind of brought me back to, you know, driving, hands on the wheel and paying attention. Whoops, I went ahead one. So when you have that moment of clarity, that brings you back to the behavior, which is conscious competency again. Okay? If you have a period of inactivity for a while, so if you haven't been on your rebreather for a while, then something else happens. You may still be that, you know, competent person that's certified in the rebreather, but you're no superhero anymore. And you have to step back and get back into things because you're conscious, but you're incompetent. So your skills have eroded because you haven't been practicing, you haven't been active in the water, and you may be a little scared because it's your first dive back in the water, but you've lost your skills, and that's when accidents happen. So that's essentially what happens when you're learning any new skill and then improving on that skill or continuing to use that skill as you go onward. And so I think that's really what's happening when Richard describes, by the time I'd had several hundred hours, I realized I knew nothing. And so it requires us to take a very active approach to kick the brain back into gear and be conscious and be competent drivers of our rebreathers. So again, the statistics. We're losing approximately 20 people per year to CCR accidents. How do we prevent this now that we recognize how we learn? Okay. Again, strange things happening to the slides. We're not losing inexperienced divers necessarily or inexperienced rebreather divers necessarily. We've lost a significant number of highly trained and experienced divers, and I think that whole learning curve and complacency curve has something to do with it. So we have to have well-practiced skills in order to make good decisions. We have to have a thoughtful approach to our diving. And that includes continued training and continued currency. So when you're selecting an instructor, if you're choosing someone to do your initial rebreather class, I think you need to choose someone who has a wide range of experience, not just in teaching, but in diving and in the type of diving that you want to get involved in. So that seems like common sense, but it's very important. We have a lot of new rebreathers coming on the market all the time now. And with these new rebreathers come new instructors who may or may not have a depth of experience either on that unit or a depth of experience in CCRs that's adequate for you to get the most out of them. I like to say it's awfully nice to learn to shave on somebody else's beard. So there's many, many stories that the experienced instructor will be able to offer to you that will help you to avoid some of those checklists. You're going to hear all of us talk about checklists this weekend, I hope. Checklists are cool, okay? And I want to really push that culture within our rebreather diving environment. I think that most fatalities could have been prevented by using a strict paper or on-screen checklist. Like I said, we're all human, we make mistakes, and that's what a checklist is there to prevent. So I'm diligent with my checklist, and I have been from the beginning, and I think that that's absolutely critical. The phone rings, the student taps me on the shoulder, my husband needs something, and I step away for a moment. When I come back, I need to be able to go back and start over and do everything by rote so that it's the same every single time. So I think we have to put a bigger emphasis on not just instructors, but industry leaders to be role models, to support this culture of rebreather diving, to make it more like being a pilot, being a part of aviation. I think that's important. So it's going to take all of us to change that behavior. Years ago, I recall being on a boat with a lot of very experienced rebreather divers, and I'd gone through my checklists and everything else, and I was ready to get into the water, and I stood up, and then my rebreather had a problem. And I sat down, and I took off the rebreather, and I said, gosh, sorry guys, I'm going to be snorkeling today. And everyone looked at me and went, what? And they wanted to know what the problem was, and I explained. And then there were 5 or 6 people on the boat that were then trying to talk me into getting in the water, that I could just dive in manual. Everything would be okay. And I remember sitting on that boat, and I remember thinking, this is an important moment. I said, if there's one thing that you'll learn from me, is I'm not getting in the water with something that didn't just pass my checklist. I think that's so critically important. And I've been on expeditions around the world and some places that I'll never be able to get back to again, where I've had to call the dive before hitting the water. And it's because my rebreather didn't pass its checklist. I think the next thing that's part of my critical 5 is the simple pre-breathe. And this has to be 5 minutes, in my opinion, and it should be relaxed, seated, with your nose blocked, and we need to encourage people to do this. So that means no walking to the dive site while you're breathing on your loop and you're not looking at your displays. No standing on the back of the boat, getting your fins on, doing your pre-breathe, or jumping in the water and doing it there. No jumping off the boat until you've done a full and proper pre-breathe. And I believe 5 minutes is a reasonable choice of time to do that. I used to be a 2-minute pre-breather, okay? But now I'm a 5-minute pre-breather. So how many people breathe their rebreather for 5 minutes prior to dive? Okay. How many people really understand why they're doing that? So do you think you're pre-breathing it for what reason? Any ideas? He says warm the CO2 scrubber. Anybody else? Checking the scrubber. Okay. Anyone else? Hearing the oxygen solenoid? Okay. When does that canister actually start working? Anyone? Thank you. You know how many people in a room will usually answer, well, it's not going to work for a couple of minutes. You've got to warm up the chemical to make it work. Well, no, it works right away. And so then people say, well, then why the heck am I pre-breathing? Because when you're seated and you're relaxed and you're looking at your displays, you are making sure that you're not going to have a CO2 hit. You're blocking your nose so that you don't sneak in a little bit of breath unknowingly to combat that rising PCO2. But you're also, yes, listening for the solenoid. You're giving enough time for the oxygen level to drop within the rebreather and to hear everything work. And within the course of 5 minutes, I think you have a reasonable opportunity to see a fully functioning rebreather and each of those things work. If you have a CO2 monitor, you're actually watching that too. If you have a TEM stick, you're actually seeing the curve change on that. So 5 minutes, I think, is a reasonable amount of time in order to see that everything is absolutely fully functional. And it gives you a time and an opportunity to relax, gather your thoughts, pre-visualize your dive, and then just remind yourself one last time, am I doing a dive that I'm capable of self-rescue for? Am I doing a dive that I'm capable of buddy rescue for? These are the things that I'll just take note of at those last moments in that 5 minutes. The decision to dive comes in concert with that pre-dive safety check and with that pre-breathe. So a significant number of accidents and fatalities are being attributed to high-risk behaviors. For those of you that have seen Andrew Falk speak, it's earth-shattering how many people with high-risk behaviors later go on to die on rebreathers. It's absolutely earth-shattering. And yet, there are so many people jumping in the water with the known issues, such as, well, one of my sensors is down, but I've still got 2 good ones. You know? Or something's wrong, but I can still dive it in manual, and that's better than his rebreather. Right? So there's a lot of people jumping in the water with rebreather issues. And what we find when we look at accident analysis is that the decisions that came to ultimately cause the fatality started a long, long time before the actual dive or the dive day itself. So these are behaviors that developed over time that people began to accept and say, well, if that's okay, well, then maybe I'll dive it this way. So if you're willing to make one exception and say, well, I'll dive it if it's just a little bit broken, what will you do next time? So you've got to give yourself a very black and white go, no-go scenario. And if you're diving in a situation where it's unacceptable to miss the dive, then you should have backup equipment. So if I'm on an expedition and I know that I absolutely must be able to film this dive, I'm not going to leave myself with the pressure of only having one rebreather on hand. I'll have a backup rebreather available, ready, pre-dive checked, and simple enough to get into, or open circuit, whatever I need. But I'm not going to hang it on a single piece of equipment in a single failure. So only after a proper pre-breathe, a proper pre-dive safety check has been done, can you make that decision to dive or to abort. Okay. Abort safely. That's another one of my 5. So in the early days, we used to really focus on staying on the rebreather loop as much as possible, to the point that we were almost sort of making fun of people that bailed out. And then we realized that, wow, you know, it's never a bad idea to bail out if you've got enough gas. It's never a bad idea to do that. So I actually encourage people to get off the loop, unless you know precisely what's going on that you can solve that issue. Then get off the loop and get your sanity back. Because if you've changed chemically what's going on in your body, whether it's high oxygen, low oxygen, high carbon dioxide, whatever, that's not going to change instantly. But if you jump onto something that's a known gas and it's safe, stay on that until you are absolutely positive that there's no cloud of judgment. In the early days, we talked about taking a sanity breath. Well, a sanity breath wouldn't do anything for you physiologically. So if you can get off the loop and abort safely all the way to the surface on open circuit, why not? It's not an embarrassment to finish a dive on open circuit. It's a safe option if you've got the gas to do it. why not? So abort safely. So whether that abort takes place on the boat or on the bottom, before or during the dive, we need to encourage people to choose safe behaviors and model safe behaviors. I think all of us, I hope I'm preaching to the choir here, that I hope all of us are pushing these role model behaviors out into the community. So in conclusion, I think you've got to first of all recognize that complacency trap and force your mind back into actively diving your gear as much as possible. But revisit training, revisit your own currency, revisit checklists, do proper pre-breathes, make a good decision to dive, and choose to abort safely, and choose the safest abort option as possible. I've come to all of these conclusions based on not just my own experiences, but also the friends lost over the years. And Richie brought up that same point. As I said earlier, it's not necessarily the inexperienced CCR diver that's come to die on rebreathers. It's people that we know and love, like Carl Spencer or Paul Blanchette or Wes Skiles. These are people that you would never have expected to die diving or die on rebreathers. And it's because they fell into the trap of missing out on one of these 5 things. And so I believe that these are, in my opinion, the 5 golden rules that can prevent most of the accidents, incidents, and fatalities in our community. I would encourage you to hear Andrew Fox's presentation. In a nutshell, if you miss it, it doesn't matter what brand of rebreather you're diving. It doesn't matter what style, meaning electronic or manual. There is no box of death. It's how we're using them. So based on his best guess of the statistics of the number of these units sold and the number of divers diving them and a rough guesstimate of how many dives they do, there's an equal percentage of fatalities on every given brand and style of rebreather. There is no box of death. It's how we use these tools and how we dive them. And so it's preventable, in my opinion, through technology and through better behaviors and through an increased awareness of a better culture of rebreather diving. All right. Thank you.